Hello everyone and welcome, I'm Max, and today I'll be talking about the future of 3D printing, or at least that's what I called a survey in November 2015. I re-uploaded this survey, and a link to this survey you can find in the description. I would greatly appreciate it if you would fill it out now before you watch this video, because I don't want that you get influenced by the result of the previous survey. If you leave your email at the end of the survey, I will raffle 3 spools of filament of Das Filament, and well, if you get lucky, you get a free spool of filament out of this. I'm doing this out of personal interest. There is no commercial interest behind this, and I will share then the results of the new survey as well. So, I hope you just came back from filling out the survey. I'm going to try to take you back to the year 2015. Back then the 3D printing community was a bit smaller. You can see this, for instance, in the subreddit 3D printing, or back then it was still called 3D printing news. It had 40k subscribers. Today it has nearly 200k. Most YouTubers, 3D printing YouTubers, were less than 2 years on the air. So for instance, Thomas Sandladerer, I think, started in June 2014. Then we have Maker's Muse. He started, I think, in January 2014. 3D Printing Nerd was on the air just a couple of months, and Richard Horn, Richard Horn is on the air for ages. He's a legend when it comes to 3D printing and YouTube. The Prusa i3 was 3 years on the market, and the MK2 was not yet released, so his big breakthrough was about to come. Cheap Chinese printers were not that common yet, and the most available 3D printers, or the most used 3D printers during that time, in my opinion, were the Ultimaker 2 and the Ultimaker Original, then the Prusa i3 DIY kit and the MakerBot Replicator. But during that time already, the 3D printing community kind of turned its back on MakerBot, because Stratasys acquired MakerBot and made it closed source, and that didn't go down too well with the 3D printing community. The consumer 3D printing hype was just over its peak. The peak itself was during the year 2013-2014. There is a especially big peak when Obama in his State of the Union speech talked about 3D printing being the manufacturing process of the future. So during that time I was thinking a lot about the future of 3D printing and tried to determine some scenarios that could be realistic for the 3D printing industry, and then at some point decided to make a survey about it and ask the 3D printing community what they think was possible. So the survey itself was quite short. There were 12 questions in total. 6 questions tried to determine the status quo, and 6 questions depicted a possible future scenario in the 3D printing industry and asked the respondents if they think this was a plausible scenario. So the first question was to determine their level of experience. So they had 4 options to choose from. If they have more than 2 years of experience, less than 2 years, less than a year, and less than 6 months. I was quite lucky with those time frames. As you can see, the percentages are quite proportional. Unfortunately, the total population, or the total sample size, is only 85, but I was already quite happy with this kind of sample size, because it's quite tough to get respondents to surveys. So I posted in a lot of forums, and I posted on Twitter and everything. I tried everything to get as many people as possible to answer this survey, but I got 85, and I was happy at that time with that number. The following question was to determine how happy the 3D printer user is with his 3D printer and its print quality, and as you can see, the average is around a 7.06. The scale was from a 1 to a 10, where 1 was the worst and 10 was the best. And you can see that there is a slight tendency that a more experienced user is going to be slightly more satisfied with this 3D printer and its quality than someone who works less than a year, for instance, with a 3D printer. So as your level of experience increases, so does your satisfaction level increase as well. You're going to see in the following questions that most of the times I'm going to split the groups in experience levels, so that you can see if a level of experience has an influence on the responses. The satisfaction level are normally distributed, so that's a quite good sign. So we got a good samples, good population that shows a big sample size, a proportional sample size. So we have some very satisfied users and some very unhappy users, but most of them are around the mean, so around the average, which was a 7. So I would say people weren't generally quite happy with their printer, but there is still room for improvement. The second question was, the third question was if they use a CAD program. I expected to see 100% everywhere, but apparently there were still some users that did not work with a CAD program, even if they had more than 2 years of experience. I was kind of surprised at that. But I'm not here to judge. For me personally, I think CAD and 3D printing goes hand in hand, and the statistic shows that generally speaking, you could say if you have a 3D printer, you're most likely to use a CAD program as well. Even those that have less than 6 months of experience, a huge majority uses a CAD program. Well, then I asked them about their 3D printing habits, meaning what do they print most of the times. Multiple selections were possible, and they could choose from 3 categories: upgrades from a 3D printer, gadget and figurines from design platforms like Thingiverse and Imagine, and my own project. The upgrades from our 3D printer group is quite interesting because you see that if you have less than 6 months of experience, only a third started printing already upgrades to their 3D printer. But as the level of experience increases, the more likely you are to print upgrades to the 3D printer. That seems plausible because you're gonna see there are some downsides to your 3D printer and want to change some features. And that is then more likely, more level of experience you have, that you will at some point start upgrading your 3D printer with 3D printed parts, and possibly also that you start printing your own 3D printer at some point. Half of them print gadget and figurines from design platforms from Thingiverse and Imagine, regardless of the level of experience, basically. And my own project, nearly every group has a huge majority that prints their own project, which I think is a great statistic because it shows that people buy a 3D printer with the aim and purpose of realizing their own projects. And the biggest group is the last in 6 months apparently, but that's just the statistical noise which you have normally. So I think in general you can say that nearly every 3D printer user works on their own projects, which I think is a great statistic to see. And in a new survey, I added a 4th category: on-demand 3D printing, because nowadays it became more and more popular that 3D printer users use their 3D printer as a small business, so they offer on-demand services, 3D printing services, and I try to gauge now if that changed the printing habits a bit. So then I asked them if they think a 3D printer is useful, and luckily none of them said not useful at all, so that's a good statistic. Then 20% said it can be useful from time to time, and 60% said it's very useful, so a huge majority says a 3D printer is a very useful machine. And 20% says it's just a hobby. And now for some people who maybe don't understand why people would respond that way, or don't get why I put this category in, let me explain. Usefulness and 3D printer doesn't have to go hand in hand, because if you think about, let's say you build RC planes and you enjoy flying them, you enjoy modifying them, you enjoy creating them, and then someone comes up to you and says, well, do you think building RC planes is useful? And your response might be, well, it has nothing to do with usefulness. It's a hobby. I enjoy it, and there doesn't need to be a use in it. So a hobby and a use, I think, doesn't have to go hand in hand, and it's for your own enjoyment. So 20% say basically, I don't look at a 3D printer and see any use in it. I just see their joy of working with such a machine. Then I asked if they have a 3D printed object that they use on a daily or at least weekly basis, and 3D printer upgrades are excluded from such a useful object. And as you can see, 3/4 of the respondents have an object which they use on a daily or weekly basis, which I thought was a great statistic. I was not expecting more than half of them to have a useful object. I think that's great to see that the users buy a 3D printer and print useful objects with it, or whatever you define useful objects. Now, I know that some people would say, well, someone would define a useful object differently than another person would. I agree with that. But that was not the purpose of the question. If you think it's useful and a useful object, that's fair enough for me. And I think it's great that people have such objects. Okay, let's go to the section of the future trend. And obviously we first have to answer, how will we print in the future? So there were 3 categories. There will be a 3D printer in every household. 30% responded this way. And I want to take you back through a thought experiment in this case, so you maybe understand a bit more why people would respond the way they did. Some people will now say, well, it's not realistic that everyone has a 3D printer in a household because, well, not everyone can use a 3D printer. They're not easy to use, and they are you don't need a 3D printer on a daily basis, so why would you buy one? Well, you have inkjet printers, don't you? And a lot of people have inkjet printers at their home, but you don't print on a daily basis. But when you need it, you have at least one in your household. So that's maybe why people said, well, 3D printer will be in every household. Maybe it's not being used on a daily basis, but if you need something, at least you have one, in a sense, this way. And maybe also the 3D printers in the future are going to look differently. And so then the 3D printers we have nowadays have nothing to do with the 3D printers in the futures, and it will become a normal household item. You can also argue saying that 3D printers is a broad term, which also include maybe a food 3D printer. So every household will have a food 3D printer. So you can interpret a lot into this question, but that's not the point of specifying exactly what a user means. I think personally it's more, I want to see how, generally speaking, people were thinking about 3D printing in the future. So, and then the second category, most people will go to a 3D printing service to print on demand. A majority said this will happen in the future. I think this is also a very plausible scenario, because if you think about it, back to the inkjet printer example or thought experiment, if you have an inkjet printer at home, you most likely have just maybe one type of paper, and you don't have specialized services. So you go maybe to, it's better to go to a copy shop where you can ask for thicker paper. Certain pages should be in color, other ones in black and white, and afterwards you want to bind those papers together. So the 3D printing service, or like the copy shop itself, offers more options than your normal inkjet printer would in your house. So it seems plausible that the same happens for 3D printing. As 3D printing machines evolve, they will get more sophisticated, they're going to be quite expensive, and if you want to have a certain object printed, it might be not possible anymore with your normal standard 3D printer, but you need to go to a 3D printing service. So these services would become then more and more popular in the future. And that's most likely what most people thought when they answered this question. And 14% said they won't print anything, it will stay a hobby for enthusiasts. And that's also quite a likely scenario. I think we're still in that stage. I don't think this on-demand printing service, some people will say, well, there are on-demand printing services. I know there are on-demand printing services out there, but if you think about it, it's usually just inventors or tinkerers who use 3D printers, but the general population doesn't use 3D printers in general, I would say. So I would still say we're in this kind of hobby / semi-professional niche. And most these 14% who answered it say this is going to stay this way. We're going to stay a hobby, and it's just for enthusiasts. And well, there are some on-demand printing services, but it's not for the general population. Now, before I go on to the next question, I need to take you back to the year 2000. Some of you will remember a illegal software program called Napster, or it became illegal when the music industry decided the smartest way to go about illegally downloading music is to sue Napster and take it down, which they then succeeded in doing. And then something called LimeWire and BitTorrent came up, and so basically what the music industry did is cut off the head snake, and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 new heads appeared. The music industry didn't handle this technological change quite well. So the internet became more and more popular by sharing files and so on and so forth, and the only thing that music industry did was seeing this technology as a threat. So instead of adopting a new approach in selling their music, they tried to stick to their old ways. So what they did is they put copy protection on CDs, so you can't transfer digital files from the CD onto your computer, and they sued, as you know, Napster and took it down. So they basically fought this whole technological change as hard as possible and didn't adopt any program that would then make it possible for users to download the music legally. Apple came along and then put in iTunes, and that was like the first step then towards the music industry adopting this technological change. And for me, 3D printing kind of was such a technological change as well. So 3D printing, I saw 3D printing that with 3D printing you could print a physical object, meaning a product, and some products could then be copied basically, and these files would be shared online, and then the industry itself maybe would go down the same route as the music industry, try to sue those platforms and get these models off the internet, and in the end would lose just like the music industry would. So I thought maybe the manufacturing industry will see this and won't repeat the same mistakes the music industry did, and as such would create open source 3D printable products. Why open source? Well, as already mentioned, copyright protection on digital files doesn't really work, because there's always someone who can circumvent those protections, and then people are going to download the program to circumvent that kind of protection, and then you lose again, and then you create another product copy protection, and then someone will again make a software to circumvent that. So you will eventually fight an uphill battle, and I think you will lose. So open source 3D printable products was for me like personally evident that would come, and I asked them, do you think 3 companies will make their products open source and 3D printable? And half of them who had an opinion on this question said yes, and half of them said no, and 15% weren't sure. So to clarify this question, I didn't ask if they want to see some that a company starts creating 3D printable products. I just asked them, do you think it's gonna happen? So do you think this scenario will happen? So in the case it would happen, would you support such an open source 3D printable product by buying a build kit? So a 3D printable product in my head involved the 3D printed parts. So you needed the digital files, which were uploaded by the company itself, so you can download them, 3D print them, and then you need probably some smaller items like an electric motor, a microchip, some bearings, some screws, nuts, and so on and so forth. So this would involve selling a build kit, and I said, well, would you support that kind of open source 3D printable product by buying this build kit? And 80% said yes. 80% of the users in the 3D printing community would buy such an open source 3D printable product by buying a build kit. 9% said, I don't see 3D printing that way, and 11% weren't sure. Maybe they couldn't figure out what kind of 3D printable product I was talking about. The next question was for me quite interesting, because I asked if they would adversely support an open source 3D printable product, meaning if there's a competitor who offered the build kit cheaper, would you buy it from the competitor? And nearly 50% of the respondents said they would adversely support the open source 3D printable product, meaning that open source has some kind of certificate to it. Meaning if you create something open source, you are more likely that you can sell it with a bigger cost difference to your competitors and still outwin them, because you started it and you made it open source. So that means open source has some kind of certificate to it, some kind of certificate feeling. No said 18%. They were still saying, well, you need to have some competition. You can't just say you're open source and as such have a cost difference and then expect people to buy or pay more for it. And 34% weren't sure, meaning, well, I didn't put a cost difference in there. So I didn't say, well, the original cost 30 while the copied version cost 20, or the original cost 100 while the copied version costs 50. So probably for them it also depends on how much more money you expect them to pay for being the original open source product. The next question was, do you wish to see a company that creates open source 3D printable products? So this question was intended for those who couldn't imagine such a scenario happening in the future, but do they want to see this future scenario? And nearly 90% said yes, they want to see such a company. And well, I think that's food for thought. If people are out there thinking about creating a product, maybe make it 3D printable. We in the community apparently are looking for open source 3D printable products. So, well, at least think about it. The next question shows that we're confident enough to print such an 3D printable product, because I asked them, would you print a household item? And 95% said yes, only 5% said no. Probably those were the response who gave the printer and the print quality a very poor rating, most likely, I'm not sure. So yeah, we're confident to print 3D printable product. I think the survey was quite interesting. I hope you found it interesting as well, and that you maybe got inspired to do something about it, or at least learn something. I would like to thank you for watching this video. My next video will be about particle emissions by 3D printers. I hope to see you then. Bye.